works.
40, 50, 60 of us decided to go into Olympia and heckle. That's about the only thing one could do. And I still remember as he marched in with fanfare music, with a spotlight on Mosley, with his 5 or 6 lieutenants, all in jack boots and breeches, because in those days they still wore uniforms. It was only later that they were banned. And tremendous excitement, just along the lines of what later they did in Europe. When he started speaking, all ran up all different people heckled. And they had hundreds of students in jackboots. And every time anybody heckled, they were thrown out very forcibly. And of course it went on and on. And you could see how some of the hecklers were treated. And we were dotted around, and I was sitting with one eye, here twos. And I said, I'm not sure. I said, you go first. And he shouted something, and within seconds, both sides of the aisle had 2 or 3 fascists each side. And as he went out, he started struggling, and they carried him away, beat him up in the gangway. And I thought, oh God, it's my turn next. What that meeting did, it brought to the attention of the press and the public for the first time in what they could see what fascism was.
So I don't know how much of that you managed to hear, but I think it does a number of things there. First of all, it's juxtaposing actuality recording with oral history, and it's encouraging the listener to compare the 2 accounts. Now, it's very rare that you can directly juxtapose memories like that with actuality recordings, but you can see when you can do it, it's incredibly effective. Now, you could have just used the Fascist March recording, or you could have just used Lou's, but by bringing them together and juxtaposing them together, it's asking all sorts of questions, isn't it, about what was going on, the atmosphere of it, his voice, the memory that's coming back from the emotion in his voice. There's a huge amount of evidence in that 2 minutes, but it's achieving a great impact. And you could see that just with or without these images, it would still create. I sometimes wonder whether I shouldn't show that image on the left, but just play the clip, whether you would have got the same visual impression from the audio. I think maybe you would, but I often use that image and I'm never quite sure. But anyway, the point I'm making is that you can juxtapose actuality recordings with oral history in a very powerful way, and it meets some of those tests I was talking about earlier in terms of veracity of evidence, different types of evidence, different versions of the truth, and so on. Now, let me romp you through a little bit of the history of museums and oral history. And I don't know if you can see from the back, but this is one of the first attempts to bring sound into a gallery. This is from 1961. It's the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And just look at the size of this enormous box that she's carrying around. But this was the first attempt to try and encourage visitors to use sound. And of course, we know that things have gone on a great deal since then. But almost certainly what she was listening to here is audio narration. This is the omnipresence of the curator in the gallery telling the visitor what to do, what to think, where to go next. There's certainly not going to be any oral history on this device. And it takes an awful long time for museum curators to realise that although technically it's possible to put sound into galleries, why not put oral history into galleries? It takes them an awful long time to realise that that's possible. And even museums like the Welsh Folk Museum in Cardiff, who were very early to collect oral history material, particularly around folklore, and the Imperial War Museum, one of the first oral history collections in the UK. They're museums, but you didn't hear any oral history in the museums. They were collecting, but they weren't interpreting it and using it in the galleries, at least not until the 1980s. And what happens in the 1980s, as we know, is that there's some very major shifts going on within oral history in Europe. And one of the major shifts is the realisation by museum curators, particularly those involved in social and local history museums, that you can use oral history as a tool for outreach, in other words, involving the community, but also in interpretation. It's suddenly realised within a new breed of museum curators emerging in the 80s that, number one, you can use oral history as a way of gathering objects. So we don't have any objects, and there's lots of museums that never had any objects, an obvious one being the Clock Tower in Croydon. They had no collection, they had to create a museum from scratch. How did they do it? They went and did oral history. The people they interviewed had objects, they brought objects into the... So it was a brilliant way of involving the community and building objects. So it was part of outreach, but also it was part of making museum exhibits relevant to the people that went to the museum. There was this real problem before the 80s where a lot of people didn't think museums were about them. They thought they were about art and they were remote, not for ordinary people. That began to shift, and oral history was central to that shift of making museums relevant, democratising museums, if you like. And you began to see a lot more oral history in display context. Museums were in the forefront of community-facing oral history projects of lots of very innovative ways. It was a very exciting time in the 1980s in museums. However, it would be fair to say there were some criticisms, and as a guy called, if you want to read anything, look at something by Kevin Moore, which was in a bibliography that I gave to Ricky actually for circulation for anyone who's interested. He was quite critical of oral history from quite a sort of traditional viewpoint of museum curation, was that oral history should not eclipse material culture. Museums are about material culture. And he was suspicious that oral history was eclipsing that material culture, relegating it, that there was too much books on walls, long extracts of oral history on the walls, rather than promoting the objects. He also said that it removed the curator from, which is the whole point, really, but there was this real sort of lack of confidence amongst some curators that they felt they were being edged out of the curatorial process by community groups and by the involvement of ordinary people within communities, which of course is the strength of oral history in that context, but you could see how it was threatening to certain curatorial professionals during this period. So there was a bit of a pushback against some of this development in the 80s, and it's still there to some degree. But it was central to what I call the democratisation of museums. And then by the late 80s, you had the emergence of a whole clutch of dedicated oral history curators in museums right across the UK. So I worked in Bradford museums in the early 80s. We did lots of exhibitions and really sort of broke the mould. But there were other oral history curators at these other places that I've talked about, and in other places around the world. So from the 90s, you see a real wave of oral history emerging in Holocaust museums, immigration museums, and World War II museums. Just two photographs here from two of my favourite ones, if that's the right word, because they're both about the Holocaust, but One is this one is here is from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and the other one is from the Holocaust Museum in Washington DC. Now it's no accident that both of those museums had oral history absolutely at the centre of what they were doing, both in terms of collecting but also interpreting and gathering a wide range of audiences into that, lots of educational programmes and so on. So you can see in major museums around the world, by the 90s, oral history was enshrined as a very important part, not only of collecting but also of interpretation. So what issues remain? Well, there's the one that Kevin Moore already evoked, are museum curators insiders or are they outsiders? How active or passive should they be? After all, they are curators. Is it possible to curate an exhibition with a whole community? There were lots of debates and questions about that, around therefore questions of the process and product that Abrams had mentioned earlier. And most challenging is the one of resources. What's happened, as we all know, particularly since 2008, but that was happening around the turn of the century. There was less money available for museums. Real cuts, public sector cuts. A lot of all those oral history curator jobs have gone, and oral history began to be seen again not as something that's central, but something as a bit of a luxury. So we're really back. We've gone back probably 15 or 20 years of development because of the lack of resources, and I've seen that in other places around the world as well. And it's, for a long time, fine art curators really weren't interested in oral history. They really didn't like the idea of the artist's voice being present in the gallery. They felt very much that they were the gatekeepers of the artist, and that the artist's voice wasn't appropriate. If the visitor wants to understand the artist, you need to look at the art, not hear the artist. Now that's beginning to change, and I'll give you an example in a moment. So let me move now on to some of the technical options, and I'm going to whip through lots of examples just to expose you to lots of different ways in which people have used oral history around the world in gallery contexts. Obviously you can transcribe the text. Easiest thing, transcript, put it on a wall. It's okay. You can better